Good evening and welcome. My name is Leah Raymond. I'm a junior here at Georgetown, and I'm also co-directing the upcoming Cardinal O'Connor Conference on Life. It is my honor to welcome you all to our debate on abortion this evening. Before we begin, just a few quick announcements. I would like to remind you of our speech and expression policy. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as our speakers tonight, it is expected that everybody in attendance at this event respect the right of the speakers to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. Throughout the duration of this event, you are allowed to use your cell phones to take photos, but we kindly ask you to refrain from any videoing of the events. The debate is being recorded in full and will be posted online. To that end, please be advised that the event is being recorded by the event organizers and portions of the audiovisual recording may be broadcast at a later time. Your entry into this area constitutes your consent to possibly being filmed, photographed, or video recorded. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderators for the evening, Elizabeth Oliver and Max Wolff-Merovick.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming tonight to Georgetown University in this beautiful Fisher's Colloquium room. My name is Elizabeth Oliver, and I serve as the president of Georgetown University Right to Life, as well as the co-director for this year's annual Cardinal O'Connor Conference on Life, the largest student-run pro-life conference in the nation, taking place this Saturday. So if you have not yet registered, there is still time. As a university club, we focus on speakers, service, and socials. Our members volunteer at local crisis pregnancy centers, like the Northwest Center, founded by Georgetown alumni in 1981. And we hold service events like diaper drives to help support women and their children. Feel free to reach out to me or the other board members of Right to Life after the event to get more involved. Tonight, we are so pleased to host this debate titled, "Should Abortion Be Legal?" I, along with my fellow Georgetown colleague Max, will help moderate. Before we begin, I would like to thank Georgetown University for supporting our group in organizing this event, especially in such a short time frame. I am deeply honored to now introduce the speaker of the pro-life position. Lila Rose is the founder and president of Live Action, a pro-life organization committed to revealing the truth about abortion and advocating for the rights of society's most vulnerable, the unborn. She established Live Action in 2003 at the age of 15, driven by a mission to expose the harsh realities of abortion. Her organization, Live Action, boasts the largest online presence in the pro-life movement, reaching 40 million per month and over 2.3 billion lifetime video views. Lila Rose was called Messenger-in-Chief of the pro-life movement by Vice News and the face of the millennial anti-abortion movement by The Atlantic. She's the author of Fighting for Life, Becoming a Force for Change in a Wounded World, which you can buy at the table in the back after the event. And she hosts the Lila Rose podcast. Lila has devoted her life to ending abortion and making America a more welcoming place for families. She is truly an inspiration to young Americans, and especially to college students dedicated to strengthening the pro-life movement. Please join me in welcoming Lila Rose. And now, I would like to pass the microphone off to my colleague Max, who will introduce himself as well as our other esteemed speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I want to start by giving a special thank you to Elizabeth, who, as my fellow moderator, did a ton of work with logistics. I'm just a talking head here. She did a ton of work behind the scenes, so please a quick round of applause for her. My name is Max Wolff-Merovick, and I'm a freshman here at Georgetown, originally from California. Before coming to Georgetown, I was a competitive high school debater, and while I'm still getting my bearings here, I've gotten involved with a few student organizations, namely the College Democrats, the Alexander Hamilton Society, and in particular, the Philonomosian Debate Society, Georgetown's foremost debate group focused on promoting free exchange of ideas and driving forward crucial conversations related to business and politics. I personally am pro-choice and have long been deeply interested in abortion discourse, particularly on the philosophical side. It's a privilege to get the chance to help moderate a discussion between such accomplished and intelligent people, and it's a personal honor to introduce our speaker on the pro-choice position. Dr. Mary Ann Franks is a distinguished legal scholar and advocate focused on civil rights, technology, and free speech. She serves as the Eugene L. and Barbara A. Bernard Professor in Intellectual Property, Technology, and Civil Rights Law at the George Washington University Law School, focusing on family law, First and Second Amendment law, law and technology, and criminal law. Dr. Franks is the president and legislative and tech policy director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, the leading US-based nonprofit organization dedicated to combating image-based sexual abuse, and has advised the federal government, state and federal lawmakers, and tech companies on privacy, free expression, and safety issues. She worked with lawmakers on what would later become the SHIELD Act, which passed the House in 2021 as part of the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. Dr. Franks is the author of the award-winning book, The Cult of the Constitution. Her second book, Fearless Speech, was published in October 2024. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a doctorate from Oxford University, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She's an affiliate fellow with the Yale Law School Information Society Project, a fellow with the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, and is admitted to practice in the US Supreme Court and the District of Columbia. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Franks.
I'll begin with our opening keynotes. Lila Rose will begin with 7 minutes, followed by a 7-minute keynote of Dr. Franks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franks, and thank you so much to Max and Elizabeth and everyone here for joining this evening. The question we are addressing tonight is this: should abortion be legal? Or to put it more simply, should murder be legal? The word abortion is a euphemism, and it is surrounded by other euphemisms like choice or healthcare. But let us speak plainly and define our terms. Abortion is the intentional killing of an innocent human life prior to birth. It involves dismembering a baby limb by limb, suctioning a baby to death, starving them to death through chemical abortion, or lethally injecting poison into their hearts or heads. These are not medical procedures to restore health. They are acts of violence that end the lives of human beings that are living. And in America, we kill over 2,800 preborn children every single day, nearly 1 million children every year. This is the greatest human rights crisis of our time. If the preborn are human beings, and it is obvious that they are, then abortion is not just a private choice, it is homicide. Let's begin with the most simple distillation of the case against abortion. This logical syllogism. Number one, it is always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Premise. Number two, another premise. Abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. And therefore, the conclusion. Abortion is wrong, and it should be illegal. In short, killing preborn human beings should be illegal for all the same reasons that killing born human beings should be illegal. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution is clear. It states, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The amendment prohibits states from denying the equal protection of the laws to, quote, any person, unquote. When it was ratified in 1868, the word person had a settled public meaning that included all human beings, including preborn children. At that time, 3/4 of the states had already criminalized abortion at all stages of pregnancy. The same Ohio legislature, which ratified the 14th Amendment, declared that abortion at any stage was, quote unquote, child murder. Their conclusion was unequivocal. Quote, "Let it be proclaimed to the world that the willful killing of a human being at any stage of its existence is murder," end quote. The structure of the argument is simple. The 14th Amendment's use of the word person guarantees due process and equal protection to all members of the human species. The preborn are members of the human species from the moment of fertilization. Therefore, the 14th Amendment protects the preborn. Senator Jacob Howard, who sponsored the amendment in the Senate, declared that the amendment's purpose was to disable a state from depriving not merely a citizen of the United States, but any person, whoever he may be, of life, liberty, and property without due process, and to ensure that even the lowest and, quote, "most despised of the human race were guaranteed equal protection as persons." Even Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote the majority opinion in Roe v. Wade, admitted this. He stated, quote, "If this suggestion of fetal personhood is established, the appellant's case, of course, collapses, for the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. If we concede that the preborn are human beings, and the science is unequivocal that they are, then our laws permitting abortion are unconstitutional. They deny the preborn the equal protection of homicide laws and subject them to discriminatory, lethal treatment." To quote my esteemed debate partner, Dr. Franks, from her insightful book, The Cult of the Constitution, quote, "The only rights any of us should have are the rights that all of us should have. If some of us are saved, if only some of us are saved, all of us are lost." Dr. Franks goes on to write, quote, "The 14th Amendment makes clear that it is impermissible and illogical to read the Constitution selectively regarding which rights it protects and whose rights it protects. The 14th Amendment strikes me as the constitutional expression of the golden rule," end quote. Science affirms that life begins at fertilization. From the moment of conception, a new, unique, and whole human being exists. This is not a matter of opinion, but of observable fact. Keith Moore, professor of anatomy at the University of Toronto, writes in the textbook, The Developing Human, Clinical-Oriented Embryology, quote, "Human life begins at fertilization, the process during which a male gamete or sperm unites with a female gamete or oocyte to form a single cell called a zygote. This highly specialized totipotent cell marked the beginning of each of us as a unique individual," end quote. And then, quote, "A zygote is the beginning of a new human being," end quote. Dr. Micheline Matthews-Roth of Harvard Medical School said in testimony to the United States Senate Judiciary Committee that, quote, "It is scientifically correct to say that human life begins at conception," end quote. By 22 days, the baby's heart is beating. At 6 weeks from fertilization, brain activity can be recorded and bone formation begins. At the beginning of the 9th week from fertilization, the baby will have grown from a single cell into nearly 1 billion cells. She will suck her thumb and swallow, grasp an object, touch her face, sigh, and stretch. Around 20 weeks from fertilization, with a lot of help, babies have survived outside the womb. Scientifically, preborn children are human beings, and every human being is a human person. Every human being, regardless of size, level of development, or dependency, possesses inherent dignity. History has shown us the horrors of denying personhood to certain groups of human beings. Whether it was African Americans in the Dred Scott decision, or Jews during the Holocaust, or even women who were denied the right to vote, every time that society strips a group of humans of their personhood, the consequences are catastrophic. Abortion is the latest chapter in this long history of injustice. Should abortion be legal? No. It is clearly wrong, and it is a direct violation of the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection under the law. Abortion is not a private decision or an exercise of bodily autonomy. Bodily autonomy is very important, but it gives zero permission to kill innocent human beings. Furthermore, parents have natural obligations to their own children, and these obligations include the activity of the parents' bodies. In other words, children do in fact have rights to the bodies of their parents. If the parent cannot care for the child, they cannot kill or abandon the child, but must see that their parental obligations are safely transferred to another party. Tonight, I urge you to stand with the preborn, the most vulnerable members of our human family. To do otherwise is to betray our Constitution, our conscience, and our shared humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Lila Rose, for your opening remarks, and we will now move to Dr. Frank's opening.
Less tall than Max is. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Lila. As you'll have heard from the introduction, I am a law professor, and I'm also an advocate for women's rights. And a lot of what I've worked on for many years of my life, my work, my passion, has been focused on women and girls in particular, and about fighting for their rights to equality, particularly focused on the questions of sexual exploitation of women and girls, calling for social and legal reform when necessary to protect that. But what you wouldn't know, there's no reason that you would know this, is that I am originally from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a pretty small place in Arkansas. I was raised a Southern Baptist, and my entire family, my community, were all pro-life. I was raised in the pro-life tradition. I have close family members who are currently active leaders in the pro-life movement. And what might be most surprising is that for most of my life, I was also pro-life, or identified that way. And a lot of the things that Lila has said so eloquently just now, I would have fully agreed with only, let's say, a decade or so ago. So what I'd like to share with you during these opening remarks is how that changed and why that changed, and how much my experience is becoming a legal scholar, learning about the law in detail, and my efforts to both recognize and articulate the ways in which women and girls are discriminated against really did shape my new understanding of the question of abortion. Because for the longest time, I thought that the really important question, the most significant moral legal question about abortion, was whether or not embryos or fetuses were fully human, and if so, what would that mean for the law? And then, the more I learned about legal rights, the more I learned about the Constitution, the more I learned about our legal history, the more I realized that the real question is actually what kind of law, what kind of obligations do we have as a society if we believe that women and girls are fully human? Let me explain what I mean. Laws of self-defense, laws of property say that the right that we all have, each of us, all of us as individuals, have to protect ourselves against uses of our bodies or our homes, even in some cases, our rights to say no to those kinds of uses, the idea that we need to consent to those kinds of uses, that is something that is reinforced by so many different aspects of our law. You think about, for instance, the law of self-defense that says if somebody is trying to hurt you and they can cause you serious bodily injury or death, you have the right to use equal force to stop them. And actually, it doesn't matter whether they're innocent, as long as the force is unlawful. If a child is pointing a gun at you, the child probably doesn't have any idea that it's posing the kind of threat that it is, but you are nonetheless entitled to save your life, even if you have to use deadly force. Now, we may not like that. That may make us uncomfortable, but that does reinforce the idea that, in fact, we have such a strong right to our own bodies, to our own life, to our own property in some cases. It's reflected, too, in the fact that if somebody wants to come inside your home, they have to be invited. And even if they're invited and they decide that they do something inside your home that you don't like, you can tell them to leave. If they don't leave, you have the right to remove them by force. Now, that can be even if they are innocent people. That can be if they just really want to hang out with you and you just want to say no. You still have that right. We can think about how, no matter what we consider other people to be, right, we don't really debate whether or not people who are trying to come into your house or a child that might need, for instance, an organ donation, they're people. There's no dispute over that. The question, though, is when are those people, any of those people, allowed to use your body or your property in a way that you have said no to? And the law says over and over again, you can't, you can't, you can't. Even if you are the only organ donor that can save a child's life, you cannot be forced to give up that organ. You can't even be forced to have your blood drawn against your consent. You can't even be forced, if you are a parent of a child that everybody agrees is a child and that you have a parental obligation, you can't be forced to give up your life for them. Now, I know many of you who are parents would say, but you would, right? You would want that to be the case. You would judge anybody who didn't, and that is entirely fair. That, however, is a completely different question from whether or not the law says you have to. Completely different question. What the law says, what the law reinforces, that even in tragic situations, even in situations where we wish that people would hold differently, we are allowed to say no to people who want to use our bodies without our consent. We have the right to say no. We have the right to say no, and we have the right to use force to make sure that they do not do that. So if we have that right, and women are full human beings that are supposed to have all of those rights, how can it be the case that in one particular circumstance, only women, only girls who are pregnant, they alone have got to just accept the fact that someone, something, however you want to call it, person, life, whatever you want to call it, is saying, I want use of your body, I want to put your health at risk, I can potentially pose a life-threatening threat to you, and all of that rights, all those rights that we would normally recognize in any other context suddenly go away, only for pregnant women and girls, that they are not allowed to say no. They alone are not allowed to say no. It is not particularly controversial, these other things I'm talking about, the fact that we are able to say, look, is it a tragic circumstance that someone might have to die or not get the organ that they wanted or not be able to use one's house in a way that could give them shelter? These things could be tragedies, but the alternative is to tell a person that they have no right to their own bodies, and to their own homes even. So if we actually thought that women were people, really thought that they were people with full rights, we would be struck by this, and we would be struck by the idea that this debate could be called, is abortion legal? Because that's like asking, should self-defense be legal? Should protection of your home be legal? And what I would want to suggest is that there's a reason why we are constantly thinking that we should put a special burden on women and girls and make them have to justify why it is that they should be able to exert the same rights that everyone else can in every other context. And I would suggest that that is not a healthy approach. So that for me, the real question here is not, should abortion be legal? It is whether it should be legal for the state to force women and girls to give birth against their will. And my answer to that question is no.
Thank you, Dr. Franks. We will now move on to the rebuttal period, which involves 5-minute speeches from each speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Franks, for your remarks and for this discussion, this important discussion. I want to address a few of Dr. Franks's points, her key points. First of all, she talked about the law of self-defense as a justification for abortion. And I think that she described, if someone is trying to hurt you intentionally, you have the right to fight back and defend yourself. And the reality is that the child in the womb is not trying to hurt anyone intentionally. The child in the womb is totally dependent on their parents. And ultimately, the child has a right to live as well. So the child also has bodily rights. And the first bodily right that they have is to protect their body from lethal violence. So I don't think the law of self-defense applies here to the case of a child, because in this case the child has a right to life, and the child also has a right to the protection of their parents. And the second point I have too, that is a very key difference here for why the case that Dr. Franks has made does not apply to the situation of abortion, is that, and she used examples of adults not having to give their kidneys to other people, even children. You don't have to draw blood without giving your consent, all of these key aspects of bodily autonomy. The reason that this does not apply in the case of the child in the womb is that children at large, including those in the womb and those outside of the womb, have a natural right to both nourishment and protection. And this natural right is first the responsibility of the parent of that child. And so as an example, Dr. Franks might respond and say, well, if the parent doesn't want the child, the parent could drop a child off at a safe haven box or give the child up for adoption. In the case of pregnancy, you can't, unless the baby's old enough to survive, you can't deliver the baby and provide that child, give that child up. But the response to this would be that the child's natural habitat is the womb. The child has a natural right to his or her mother's womb. The womb is actually designed to bring that child into existence and to nourish that child. And so to say that the child doesn't have a natural right to his or her mother's womb is in fact false. And I'd invite you to consider a scenario where if the whole world of adults, people that have their own bodily autonomy, all agreed together, we don't want to care for children because a toddler, we don't want to extend our bodies to provide nourishment to a toddler or to newborn children, and so therefore we have the right to kill them because we have our bodily autonomy that we don't want to extend to provide for these children, using our bodies to care for the children, using our bodies to rock the children to sleep, using our bodies to go and collect nourishment for the child. It would still be wrong, even if the adults made the choice to say, I don't want to use my body to help these children, it would still be wrong to kill those children or to deliver them to a condition of neglect so that they would eventually die. That would still be wrong. And so it follows that adults at large, and certainly parents, have natural responsibilities to care for their children. The United Nations in Article 3 on their treatise on the rights of children specifically says, in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. Children have rights too. And interestingly, Dr. Franks seemed to concede the point that we are talking about human beings, and it appeared that she may have conceded the point. I'm going to be asking her in cross-examination or welcome her to share this in her rebuttal. She even seemed to perhaps concede the point that children too are persons. And yet it seems that she has made this case, constructed a case to say that effectively they are second-class persons, that they are second-class citizens, and that their bodily autonomy rights, their right to protect themselves and be protected by the law from lethal violence. We're not just talking about being pregnant, for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months. We're talking about entire, potentially 100 years of life, the lifespan of a person, maybe an average of 70 years of life, that they don't have the right to live that life and to receive the care that you and I, Dr. Franks, and everybody in this room was privileged to receive as children. Just think of it, if none of us here received that care, we would not be here. Any civil society, and I want to close with this, any civil society must care for its children and respect their natural rights, and that first right is life. Thank you.
Thank you, Lila Rose. And now we move on to 5 minutes from Dr. Franks for a rebuttal.
The invocation of natural rights is always an interesting one, because usually what people mean by that is something like a religious sense of what they believe to be true about personhood, about rights or obligations. With all due respect to that, people are entitled to have those religious beliefs, but there is nothing like a consensus about those. There are multiple religions that actually believe that a child isn't a person until they take their first breath. That's a valid position to take. It is what some religions actually believe. There are a lot of religions and religious people who believe that until the moment of quickening, there is no soul in the fetus, and therefore it is not a person. In fact, that's what the Catholic Church believed for a really long time. Interestingly enough, they thought that the quickening happening later for girls than it did for boys, and that's an interesting question to ponder. If we're going to speak of natural rights, the danger of this is that we know throughout history there have been references to natural rights, to what God intends, to what we all know to be true. That has been used to defend every possible atrocity you can imagine. Natural rights don't mean anything in them and of themselves. There is no somehow persistent, transcendent truth out there that is simply true all the time, at all places, no matter what the context. That isn't something that is real. It is a subjective belief. And subjective beliefs are very valuable. But the entire point of law is that we don't get to impose our subjective beliefs on other people. We can be constrained from hurting other people, but we also have rights not to be hurt by other people. And I have to clarify that no, it's not the case that you're only allowed to engage in self-defense against someone who is not innocent or someone that is intending to hurt you. If a reasonable person in your position would believe that there is a threat, You are entitled to use force, even if it's something tragic, like a child who has picked up a gun and doesn't know the kind of threat that they're posing. We do not make exceptions for this. It is not just against people who are not innocent. Sometimes innocent people will have to die because no one has a right, natural or otherwise, to life that is contingent upon extracting something from your body without consent. That is not a right. And even if we want to look to the Constitution as the great law, perhaps as some sort of divinely inspired law, I'm pretty fond of the 14th Amendment, as Lila has mentioned. I use it a lot in my first book. But note that the first thing the first 14th Amendment says is all persons born or naturalized in the United States, not gestated, not fetuses, persons born. There's a reason why we have a dividing line at birth for many concepts of personhood. Personhood is obviously a complex concept. It doesn't mean the same thing in every context. There's a reason why we don't count fetuses in the census. There's a reason why we don't think that they can be classified as dependents on your tax forms. That doesn't mean that there's no life there. It doesn't mean that we have to say there's no value there. But it matters what the context is. And again, the important context is any person, and I do want to clarify when we talk about adults, right, versus children. Children can get pregnant. Children do get pregnant. 10-year-olds get raped and get pregnant. So if we're going to talk about who's got rights where, what about the rights of the 10-year-old girl who's pregnant and whose body may very well not be able, probably won't be able to survive that pregnancy? We feel so sure in saying that, well, she is sort of a person. That fetus, though, more of a person. It is not about classifying fetuses and embryos and whatever else as second-class citizens. It's about insisting that women and girls are not second-class citizens, that once again, we cannot justify. There is no principle of justification that says women and girls alone, the ones who get pregnant, do not have the same rights as everyone else would have. Again, the right to eject somebody from your home using force if necessary. That's a right that we all have. And yet we're willing to say, no, someone has to welcome a bodily use that is intimate, that is permanent in some ways. Yes, the pregnancy will end at some point, but the impact will not necessarily. That we have to say that that person has got to accept all of those things, even though no man, no boy will ever have to be asked to do that. And that in any other context, we would not agree that they do not have that right to say no. I think that the only way, once again, that we can insist that that kind of exceptional treatment is something we can reserve for pregnant women and girls has got to stem from the belief that women and girls are not full human beings. And because I believe that women and girls are full human beings, that is a proposition that I have to reject.
Thank you, Dr. Franks, for that rebuttal. We will now be moving into a period of cross-examination, where Dr. Franks will ask Lila for 6 minutes on a cross-examination section by asking questions, and Lila will respond. And then we will have a period where Lila will ask Dr. Franks questions for 6 minutes, and Dr. Franks will respond.
My first question is kind of a hypothetical. Imagine that a mother is the only viable organ donor for her sick toddler. But she's pregnant, and if she continues her pregnancy, she won't be able to donate this organ, and it means that the child is going to die if they don't get this organ. If this woman in this position continues the pregnancy and the toddler dies, do you believe that the mother in this situation has committed murder?
No.
If she ends the pregnancy to provide the organ in order to save her toddler's life, do you believe that she's committed murder?
I think if she terminated the pregnancy with full knowledge that the child that she was ending the life of was a human being, I think that it would certainly be an act of homicide. Would it be an act of murder? I think you could say there's a case of duress and stress in that situation that should be taken into account because she really wanted to save the life of her toddler. But if you, with full knowledge and the life of your unborn child, that is an act of homicide, yes.
In 2023, the executive director of Cincinnati Right to Life organization argued that raped 10-year-olds are capable and should carry their attackers' children to term. This is a quote from her. I know that a 10-year-old might not understand pregnancy, but I also know that a 10-year-old understands life and playing with dolls. I know that when my daughter was 10 years old, she cried and begged for a little sister or a baby. And while a pregnancy might have been difficult on a 10-year-old body, a woman's body is designed to carry life. That is a biological fact. Do you agree with this statement?
I think that a 10-year-old child who's been a victim of sexual assault is an absolute victim, and it's absolutely horrific. She deserves care and support and to be removed from anywhere close to her abuser. He needs to be thrown behind bars. But I do not think the solution to the trauma and the violence of rape is to commit a second trauma and an act of lethal violence against now an innocent third party if a baby is conceived. We don't give the death penalty in this country to rapists. It's decided by our Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. I don't see how it can be just to give the death penalty to an innocent unborn child for a crime that, of course, they did not commit.
If life begins at conception, is the removal of an ectopic pregnancy murder?
It is not. Would you like me to explain why?
Yes, please.
In an ectopic pregnancy, the child is developing in a hostile environment. He or she is not developing in the womb, and he or she has already died by the time there may be an ectopic pregnancy removal, or is going to die, and the mother will likely die as well. So removing that child, the intent of that act is not to end the life of that child. It is to remove that child from a hostile environment for that child and to save the life of the mother. I sincerely hope that if we invest the resources we should in research to determine a way to save that child's life and the mother's life, I would love to see that medical advancement happen.
And just if I could get clarification, you mentioned that child is going to die. So if a fetus or an embryo, a fetus is likely to die, is likely not to survive, do you believe that it's acceptable in those situations, apart from an ectopic pregnancy, to terminate those pregnancies?
If you're referring to a child that is developing not in an ectopic pregnancy, developing in the womb, and they may die, you're saying because of a medical disability, or what are you're referring to, some sort of terminal illness? Just to be clear about your question.
To a situation where the fetus has been assessed to be non-viable, not because of the timing of pregnancy, but because of some sort of fetal abnormality.
But in this scenario, to be clear, the child is still alive and growing. It's not dead already.
I'm afraid that's not a question that I can answer.
I think it's a crucial one, and I would answer if the child has already passed away, because, as you said, they have some severe abnormality that would lead to its death, and it has passed away, then I think it's completely licit to remove that child. If the child is still living and growing, and they're in their mother's womb where they belong, I think it's wrong to choose when the death date is for that child. That child deserves a right to life, and even if that child will live for a few months longer, I mean, sometimes these babies with severe disabilities live for years, I think they deserve to have a natural lifespan and not have it cut short by an act of lethal violence.
Would you support a law that would require parents to be organ donors for their children?
I would not.
Can you explain why?
Of course. Well, I think it would be a very good thing for parents to be organ donors for their child, and if I had the opportunity, I would be an organ donor for my child. Organ donation is not something that always works. Organ donation is something that is an elective, surgery that some people choose to undergo to save the life of a loved one. And it is an unusual, abnormal circumstance because of something that severely went wrong, a disease or a disability that somebody is undergoing. And so while I think it is very noble for somebody to donate an organ, I don't think we should have laws requiring it. Being in your mother's womb is not a matter of taking your mother's, receiving your mother's kidney. You're in the natural habitat where we all began our lives, and you have a natural right to continue to grow and not be killed. Organ donation involves a child that, in your scenario, that might receive a donation and might be able to live longer. An act of abortion is active killing. So I would not be okay with a parent who had a child who needed an organ donation going and killing their child, but I would not require the parent to donate their organ.
You would be okay with the parent letting their child die because of the lack of an organ?
I mean, I would, if I was talking to the parent personally, I would say if there's a way to, get them on an organ donation list, I would highly recommend that. I think that's one of the beautiful things that we have in this country is the organ donation lists from those that can donate their organs because perhaps they've undergone brain death, but they can then donate the organs even though they themselves have passed away. That's typically how organ donation is done in this country.
Thank you both for that period of questioning and answer. And now we'll begin with Lila, who will question Dr. Franks. Again, 6 minutes. Thank you.
Dr. Franks, is a child a person?
Is a child a person? Yes, in most situations, I would say yes.
When is a child not a person?
If by child someone is referring to what they believe for personal, moral, religious reasons, let's say a zygote or a fetus or an embryo, I would say in some situations that is not a person.
To be clear, I'm defining child as a young offspring of two members of the human species. So the law of biogenesis, a member of the human species, that's a very young member of the human species. So we're talking about both unborn and very young born children. Are they persons?
I would make a distinction between the unborn and born.
And what is the scientific case for making the distinction that the unborn human is not a person, but the born human, minutes after birth, is a person?
Scientifically, I don't think that is the right question. The question of whether or not someone is a person is a philosophical question. Science can tell us things descriptively. They can tell us, is this a being that has brainwaves? It can tell us whether or not certain aspects of the body have developed. It cannot actually answer the question of whether or not a being is a person.
Let me clarify then, that's fair, let me clarify. Are all members of the human species, are all humans persons?
Ones that are born, yes.
Okay, so you're saying that at birth you become a person philosophically in your view. What are you basing that on?
I am mostly responding legally. Philosophically, I may, or as a matter of personal opinion, I may have different views, but as a legal matter, yes, born.
But we build our laws on certain moral philosophies, is that correct?
We build on them, yes.
So what is the moral philosophy for what you're defending as the correct legal position to deprive children before birth of all their rights, including their bodily autonomy to have their bodies protected from lethal violence?
The answer that I've given in my opening statement and in my rebuttal is that the person that is pregnant has rights, and that there aren't any rights that an unborn, whether we want to call them a person or not, has that can override those.
So to be clear, I'm not denying that persons that are born, women included, have rights, but I'm asking if the child before birth, what is the philosophical framework for saying that the child minutes before birth doesn't have a right to life legally?
The philosophical argument would be that the alternative to say that this is a being with full human rights would mean that you could override the actual person that everyone does agree is a person with rights, that you could override theirs, and that is not a sustainable or intelligible position.
If a person doesn't want to care for their newborn, do they have the right to leave their newborn to die and not use their body to care for that newborn?
Given that the newborn is born, no, they would not have that right,
Why?
because that is a person who has been born.
Again, I want to understand your distinction about why birth, it sounds very arbitrary, why birth is the place that you would suddenly assign personhood rights. I want to just read you a quote from Harry Blackmun again and ask your position on this. He says, this is the justice who wrote the majority opinion in Roe v. Wade, if this suggestion of fetal personhood is established, the appellant's case, of course, collapses, for the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment.
For what it's worth, I think Justice Blackmun wasn't a very good justice. So if we want to start criticizing the Roe decision, I would be very much critical of the Roe decision. But to the extent that he is saying, if this were proven, this would be the case, that is a big if, and the if has not been answered because the personhood question can't be answered in a scientific way because it is a philosophical and moral question. And again, if that were the conclusion that one had, that it did have all of these rights and that they were rights that overrode what you are calling arbitrary, I think the fact that this is a person who is inside another person is not in fact arbitrary, and that is a limit that makes sense.
Does the preborn human have any rights at all?
Does the preborn human Rights, no.
No rights. So it would be listed in your view to have, to end the life of a preborn child at, say, 7 months for any reason.
I would not call it ending the life. Terminate a pregnancy at 7 months, yes.
Is it ending a life?
It
Is
is ending a
terminating a
pregnancy.
pregnancy of a 7-month-old
It is ending
living
a
fetus ending a life?
7-month pregnancy.
Is there a life that you have to end in order to end the pregnancy?
I would not say so.
So you're saying that the unborn human is not alive?
I would say that for the purposes of whether or not you are allowed to terminate a pregnancy and how that needs to be understood legally, the word life here would not be relevant.
Why is the word life not relevant when you're talking about lethal violence against a developing human?
Well, I am not talking about lethal violence against a developing human, which is kind of my point.
So in your view, the act of sectioning a developing, living human to death is not violent?
What I've said is that if a fetus is not born, they are not a person, they are not a human life in that sense, no matter what the method might be. Ooh, I just got cut.
And in the scenario where you're talking about you making your case on bodily autonomy, in this scenario where all adults do not want to use their bodies, they choose not to use their bodies to care for a newborn, does that newborn have the right to the bodily care of an adult?
The bodily care of an adult, not to the extent that you can use an organ or be inside someone's body without consent, no.
Do they have to use their arms, their physical arms, and their hearts, the organ of their heart and lungs that are enabling them to move their arms, to go and collect food for that newborn?
Could you repeat that?
Does an adult have to use their physical arms, which are mobilized because of the beating of their heart and the breathing of their lungs, to go and collect food for a newborn?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Does a person have to use their body to go and collect food for a newborn? Does an adult have the responsibility to do that?
Does an adult have a responsibility to go and get
To use their
food?
body?
Not to endanger their body, no. They're not required to sacrifice their life or their health to get food for the newborn.
So are you saying abortions are only listed in the case that the person is sacrificing their body up till death?
A person who has said, I do not want to have this pregnancy, is allowed to say that they no longer want that pregnancy.
What if somebody doesn't want to use their arms and their legs to go collect food for a newborn? They don't want to use their body to go collect food for a newborn. Do you have the right to not do that?
Again, the distinction that I am making is that you cannot use someone's body, that another being cannot be inserted into, nor could we
They would
extract
be
from
using their
someone's
body in this scenario to collect food for the newborn.
Not in the way that a pregnancy is, no.
I think we'll have to end that period there. Thank you both for that period of cross-examination. You may now both take your seats if you like. We'll move now into a 10-minute period of open dialogue where you can just speak freely, and we'll begin with a question from the moderators. So just so that the audience has a sense of what your ideal world looks like, would either of you care to sketch out the ideal legal framework surrounding abortion? For Dr. Franks, that means, would you support any limits on legal abortion? For Lila Rose, does that mean that you would you support any exceptions to a kind of abortion ban? And feel free to break down federal versus state, just to give people a sense of where you stand on the legal issue, and then feel free to get back into personhood or wherever the discussion may take you. Thank you.
Do you want me to start? Or in terms of whether I would think, and again, I would want to phrase it this way to make clear what the consequences of this are. Do I think that it is ever justifiable for the state to force a woman or a girl to give birth against her will? And I would say no.
I would say, well, first of all, an abortion is a forced birth. The baby has to be removed one way or the other. But I think that, yes, all children deserve legal protection, born and unborn, and legal protection a foundational legal protection from being killed, from being murdered. And that would include the act of abortion, because abortion is direct and intentional killing, which I think has been established and largely agreed to, although I understand Dr. Franks is not viewing them as persons, but they are developing humans that are killed via an abortion.
If you'd like to bring up either of you, you can offer some questions for the other person, or we can also lead.
I would like to, I can start unless you'd like to start. It sounds like you kind of said it a few moments ago, that your case hinges on this idea of, bodily autonomy, which we agree that we all have bodily autonomy. It's about to what extent can you use your bodily autonomy to then go kill somebody else that you find inconvenient to your bodily autonomy. But I am curious, you said something about if the pregnancy, you seem to intimate that if the pregnancy was life-threatening, that's why it is similar to having to give up your organ that you need to live to a born child who needs that donation. Are those cases unique and the only cases that you would be okay with abortion where the pregnancy is life-threatening, or you're just saying any pregnancy, period? Or is it just life-threatening ones in your view?
No, I am saying that, as I attempted to say before, but I'll clarify, that one way of answering that question is to say, should abortion always be legal? And I think the answer is yes, because the way that I would view that question is, can the state ever legally force somebody to give birth against their will? And my answer to that is no.
I mean, feel free to ask a question too, but I'd love to continue the line of questioning we were on earlier, if that's all right. I was asking about the person who needs to use their body to provide care for another body. And this is the state of virtually all parents. And if the parent chooses to give up their child for adoption per se, they're not allowed to do that unless they entrust that child to the body of another adult that then will use their body to care for that child. So I'd like to better understand why that kind of use of someone's body, including when it can be very stressful, by the way. Caring for a newborn is not an easy task. You could even argue it's a harder task than pregnancy. I've been pregnant 4 times, and caring for a newborn, long sleepless nights, nursing the baby, feeding that baby every few hours, it can be very demanding. And some people might argue it's even more demanding than pregnancy, and this is a demand on both parents, typically, if they have child has 2 parents or certainly 1. I'd like to better understand why that is, in your view, an acceptable use of forcing someone to use their body to do something.
So you're asking whether or not it is the requirement that a parent has to provide for their children, why is that an acceptable use of their body?
Correct.
Okay. And I would say it's incidental whether or not you have to use your body, but again, the question is whether or not you have to invite a body into your body to accept an intrusion or to accept all the things that come along with even healthy pregnancies. Childbirth is 14 times more likely than abortion to result in death. We know that it carries with it the increased risk of diabetes, stroke, heart disease, hypertension. These are all conditions that are quite serious. They're not merely inconvenient, and that's added to the fact that we are fundamentally, I think, disagreeing about, well, let me back up and say, I think we're fundamentally disagreeing about whether or not we can dismiss pregnancy as merely inconvenient for people. That I would suggest that if we are going to think of pregnancy as something meaningful and all the beautiful or terrible things that come along with it, it's only meaningful in the sense and defensible in that sense if a person can say no to it. When you force someone to undergo something that is going to impact their body in such a severe way and impact their psychology and impact their entire trajectory of life, then that has to be something they have to consent to.
I would say, the risk of postpartum depression is real, and there are even some mothers who experience postpartum depression and choose to act out in violence against their children, but there are still legal rights that those children have, despite the life-threatening experience that mother may feel by having to deal with the care of their child and use their body to care for that child. I mean, you dismissed it as incidental, I think was the word you used, this care that a parent has to use for their newborn. I wouldn't consider it incidental whatsoever. I think it's very serious care and demanding care and important care. I agree that pregnancy is meaningful, but I would like to just pose the question again. I don't feel like that has been answered yet. Why bodily autonomy doesn't count for a parent after birth, and it only counts for a mother before birth, up until the point where she can literally kill her child, but after birth, she has no right to in any way harm her child.
Yeah, this is not, I do think that we're using different terminology for these things. The question about whether or not you are allowed to be obligated to your child in some way. As I mentioned, parent and child relationship requires certain types of obligations that most of us think are correct.
Like
you are
what?
not actually required to risk your life for your child. You are not. You are not required to endanger your health. It may be that that happens, but you are not legally required to endanger your health. You are not legally required, and I think you said you should not be forced as a parent to donate an organ, even if that's the organ that's going to save that child's life. You don't think that people should be able to be forced to do that, and I agree.
So you're aware that one of the many justifications people use for abortion is mental health?
I don't think we need justifications, but certainly that's how some people describe it, yes.
So if someone were to make the case to you that my mental health was so at risk that I'm suicidal because of my child and having to use my body to care for my child, that child in this case, under your framework, would be an aggressor and dependent on that parent's body as a newborn, can do nothing but for itself, can't feed itself, can't clothe itself, can't shelter itself. And if the parent is so stressed out by this that they're considering suicide, I'm talking about obviously a very extreme case here for the purposes of this debate, would you say in that case the parent has the right to neglect or abandon or kill their child?
No, but once
Why?
again, we are talking about a difference of, is the child needing your organs? And on that point, you said you also agree that children are not entitled to their parents' organs. Do you not agree with that?
To be clear, I was speaking about that in the case specifically of organ donation that would lead to the death of the parent. That's a very particular case.
So if it wouldn't
Yes,
cause death?
To be clear, parents do have a right or have a responsibility to lend, yes, their organs in the sense that their organs are supporting the bodily function that allows for them to provide for their child.
Well, one can
And
donate
in
a
that
kidney
ca-
without
Let
dying,
me just give an example,
right?
just to give a quick example so that we put color on this. If my child is about to put his or her hand on a hot stove, it would be parental neglect, and I'm seeing this happen, to not use my body to take my child away from that stove. It would be parental neglect to not use my body to go up in the middle of the night when I'm exhausted, if that child is hungry, and to feed that child and to allow that child to suffer and starve and not eat. So
Okay.
in these cases, I do have to use my body.
If the child will die if you don't give it a kidney, though, you don't think that you can be forced to give a kidney?
There's an extraordinary in the case of a kidney, I would strongly encourage that child does.
But I'm only
does
asking
get a
whether or not
kidney.
they can be forced to. If a parent doesn't want to, can they be forced?
I don't think the parent can be forced to do an
Why
organ
not?
donation
The
thing.
child is going to die.
But I do think the parent can be forced to use their body to care for that child, both in pregnancy and in
Except to
parenthood.
give up a kidney.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question to explore, but I would say, and I would be
suggest
curious
that it is
about
the
the case of
question,
it.
that there's
cases
a
of it.
boundary between the obligations we have to care for a child and whether or not you can actually give up an organ and be
But
forced to give up an organ.
your example doesn't fit your argument for abortion, because in the case of an abortion, your womb is being used to develop with the child, but you're not giving the child your womb per se, that you're removing the womb and lending the womb for the rest of your life to your child. You're not giving the child permanently your kidney. You're using your
So if
body.
they could return your
just to be
kidney,
clear,
they would be
this is-
fine.
This is a really important point. This is, I think, where this confusion seems to be. In a pregnancy, you are lending your body, to your child, just as you lend your body to a newborn child. Now, the relationship obviously looks different, and how your body is being used, it's incredibly intimate in a pregnancy, but it is also still very intimate for the care of a newborn.
Yes, so if I take you correctly, a man who really wants to have sex with a woman and she says no, he says, well, it's only that I'm going to borrow your vagina for a while. It's not going to be forever, and you'll be fine afterwards. That should be okay, right?
And you're saying in the case of rape?
What I'm asking
Absolutely
is,
not.
what I'm
A
asking
man-
is, why isn't that a good reason to say, if the argument is, well, it's okay because we're just
Because
borrowing
children
your
have-
body for a moment, however long, 9 months, if that's how we're going to do the moral calculus, then why can't we say, well, we're just going to borrow your vagina for a while?
Well, it's actually not just 9 months, it's technically 18 years, and it's particularly in the early years when the child can't feed or clothe or shelter or care for him or herself that the parent is responsible for using his or her body.
I was just talking about the womb rental.
Yeah,
as you put
and
it.
I'm talking about the arms and legs rental that it takes to care for a newborn.
But to my point,
What do you think
what
about
is the
arms and legs
same-
rental?
What
Do
is
you
the
think that that's
same-
acceptable?
To my question, which is, isn't it a justification for a man to say, look, you can't complain that I'm going to want to have sex with you against your will because it's just going to be for a little bit of time?
I think that's ridiculous. No man has a right to have sex with a woman of his choosing. I think that's ridiculous. A child, as you, I think, agree, at least to some degree, has the right to the care of an adult. And you seem to agree that the child has the right to the care of an adult if the child is born. If I understand you correctly, does an adult have a responsibility to use his or her arms and legs and torso and head and the supporting organs to go and get care for a newborn? In that case, the entire body is engaged.
The distinction that you made before was that you think that all those
I'd love
things...
an answer to that.
The distinction that you made was that you think that they do have that obligation, but they don't have an obligation to give an organ, which means that you think that there is a line. And I'm suggesting that I also think that there is a line.
Do you think there's a difference between a kidney and a womb?
Do I think that one is more or less intimate than the other? No.
What is a womb designed for?
I think you probably should answer that.
You don't know what a womb is designed for?
I would love to hear your answer about what you think a womb is designed for.
I think a womb is designed for developing a new human life. Do you
Unfortunately-
disagree?
So all of the
Unfortunately,
women who
that is all
cannot
the
have,
time
whose
we
wombs are
have.
inhospitable to pregnancy, they are just what exactly?
I mean, in that case, if you're saying they have a issue with their reproductive system where their wombs are inhospitable, then I would say they deserve health care to determine how to get them in the healthiest position so that if they choose to bring a child into this world, that child can be in a
That
hospitable
is a very
place.
telling response. Thank you.
I encourage you both to finish these in your concluding statements, which we'll be moving on to now. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will now be moving on to our concluding statements, which will be 3 minutes to each speaker. Lila Rose, you will begin with 3 minutes, and Dr. Franks, you will conclude afterwards with 3 minutes. Afterwards, we will move into a period of student Q&A. So please, students, think of some good questions for our speakers. You may line up in the back where we have one of our volunteers who will have a microphone to ask questions. Thank you. Lila, you may begin. Please take to the podium. Thank you.
First off, abortion is not withholding care. Abortion is the active and intentional killing of a child. So already this distinction that's been made multiple times by Dr. Franks, I think, doesn't fit. In an abortion, you're not simply saying, I won't use my body to care for you. You're intentionally going in there into the body of a woman to remove violently, for the purposes of killing, that unborn child. Dr. Franks said that abortion through all 9 months was acceptable. And the reason for it was that no woman has the responsibility for her womb to be used by her child. I found that interesting because in the case of a child that is old enough to survive outside the womb, that child, by the own definition of Dr. Franks, can survive outside the womb getting the care, the bodily care of other adults. That child should have the right to life and the right to protection, even under Dr. Franks' own framework. But she went as far as saying that even through all 9 months of pregnancy, the active killing of that child is acceptable. The reality is this, as I said in my opening statement, a child in the womb is a member of the human species, and all members of the human species are persons. And throughout our history in this country, when we have deprived any human of personhood rights, we have welcomed some of our greatest injustices. And we are currently living at a time of one of our greatest injustices, which is abortion, with 1 million abortions committed every year. Even our current legal system that Dr. Franks says is not respecting the rights of fetuses under the law at all in states that have abortion to be legal, has fetal homicide laws that recognizes that, yes, there are cases where that fetus does have some rights. So even the current framework, of states that are in support of abortion allow for seeing the child in the womb as persons. The ultimate question that we have to answer is this, and it's a question of the responsibilities of adults to children. And this is my final challenge and encouragement to Dr. Franks. None of us would be here without the bodies of the parents or the people who took on the responsibility of raising for us. None of us would be here. We all need other people to be born, to grow, to thrive, to survive. And this interdependence that exists in any civilization does not mean that children should have less rights. It actually means that children should have more rights because they are dependent and fragile and need care. Even the United Nations has acknowledged this, that the rights of children should be considered first. And we know that these children, of course, include our unborn brothers and sisters in the womb. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lila Rose, for that conclusion. And now we'll move on to 3 minutes from Dr. Franks.
None of us would be here without the particular fortuitous combination of an egg and a sperm. Does that mean that we could take a woman and extract eggs from her because all of those are potential lives? Does it mean that we can tell men that they have to collect all of their semen and keep it somewhere because it could become a potential life? And has to be under someone else's decision to do something with it so that others like us could exist now. If we think that that's not right, we have to think about why that's the case. Now, I'll go back to my days as someone who identified as pro-life. I used to contemplate the question of, why was the slogan for so many pro-life movements, choose life? I used to think about this a lot. And at the time, it didn't seem contradictory to me to use the term choose life. And it really wasn't until I was teaching law when I was describing for my students what it means to act under duress, what it means to act when someone tells you, you have to do this, otherwise I will kill you, you have to do this, otherwise I'll put you in jail, and how that means that that isn't a choice. Anytime you are told you have to do something, anytime someone can do something against your will, you no longer have a choice. So if we want people to choose life, that is a perfectly legitimate moral position. We can encourage people to choose life. We can encourage them to choose any number of things. The question for the law is, when are we allowed to take that choice away? We are not allowed to take it away from people when it comes to their organs. We're not allowed to take it away from them even when it comes to a blood draw. We're not allowed to take it away from them even if someone is inside your house, not even necessarily putting you in danger, but you have said, I don't want you here anymore. We are not allowed to tell somebody that they have to get into a car with somebody, even if maybe that person doesn't mean you any harm, because we have a choice for all of those things. And one of the most complicated things about maturity as a society, as human beings, is understanding that people make choices that we don't like sometimes. That is actually the way that we express our respect and our dignity for human beings and their personhood, is by respecting their choices, because the alternative is to say, I know better than you, I can tell you what to do, I want you to choose this, and I'm not going to give you any other option. But as 18th century feminist Mary Wollstonecraft said, how can a being be generous who has nothing of its own, or virtuous who is not free? There is no choice if you tell someone that they have to do what you want them to do. It might be true, and perhaps it would be fair to say, that a society that forces women and girls to give birth against their will is a society that treats fetuses as people. We can only say that they can do that at the cost of treating women and girls as if they were not.
Thank you both. We will now be moving, as Elizabeth mentioned, to a Q&A period for about 10 or 15 minutes. So students with questions, please make sure you state to whom you're directing your question. It can be either Dr. Franks or Lila or both. And then after your question, please make sure to take a seat because there will be no follow-up questions. Thanks.
This question is for Lila. In your opening statement, you said, as part of your syllogism, that taking an innocent life is always wrong. On November 17, 2023, you said that although Hamas uses the bodies of innocent children as human shields, you believe that Israel has been more humane than the West, even though you admit that they continue to bomb those children and kill them, and that the only just resolution to a war will be to continue bombing those children until Hamas secured its full and unconditional surrender. Why did you believe that killing innocent children then was justified on consequentialist grounds, but is not justified in the context of this debate?
It is always wrong to kill an innocent child, period, including bombing them. If Israel was targeting the bodies of Gazan children, Palestinian children, to bomb them, I would say that's a despicable war crime.
Thank you both for being here. It's always incredible seeing people respectfully having such a conversation about such a divisive concept. I'm a student and a survivor of sexual violence. As you were responding to Dr. Frank's question about a 10-year-old being raped, you stated that the trauma of a rape does not carry onto a pregnancy. I would like to ask why you believe that or why you would state that. As a survivor, I wholeheartedly believe that consent is the foundation of this conversation. A follow-up question is, to what extent are we willing to sacrifice the rights of women? Revoking this choice from women will also, and to a far greater extent, other us and uphold and further the patriarchal structure that women are already confined to. If you want me to repeat either of those questions, let me know.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, my statement is that the trauma of a rape, and rape is horrifically traumatic from those that I've talked to about the horror of it, is not healed by an abortion. And I think that's a really important point, that you're not undoing trauma of the rape by committing an abortion and taking the life of that innocent third party.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I also wanted to thank both of you for being here. My question is, I feel like this debate maybe lacked a little bit of like a middle ground where, and my question, I guess, is for Lila. If we're thinking about an abortion before a fetus begins to feel pain, which I think is about 24 weeks, and if we're comparing that to, say, they're born into the foster care system where they live an extremely painful life, you know, potentially like struggling from malnutrition, maybe dying early, illnesses. I'm wondering like how, from potentially utilitarian perspective or like a virtue perspective, how you would weigh those two, how you would weigh like a painless death in the womb versus like a painful existence.
I mean, there's argument, as you may be well aware, of giving quote-unquote painless deaths to children with disabilities who are born, very sick or ill, or even poor children who are born. A painless death of an innocent child doesn't make it a righteous death or killing. It's not ever acceptable to kill someone who is an innocent human being, regardless of whether you might think that they're going to experience misfortune in their future, they're going to face difficult circumstances. I think our focus should be on alleviating the difficult circumstances that a child may face. Like you mentioned, the foster care system facing malnutrition if they're not being properly cared for by foster parents. We should face on alleviating that situation, removing those foster parents' care of that child, giving that child proper nutrition. Our focus should not be to somehow find a painless death for that child because they are facing difficult circumstances. We should work to end those difficult circumstances and protect the life of that child.
Hello, my name is Asha. Ms. Rose, Dr. Franks, it's an honor to speak to you both. Thank you for being here and coming to our university. Ms. Rose, firstly, I appreciate you being here. A lot of my beliefs are based off of Live Action's work. And Dr. Franks, thank you for your arguments. As someone who wants to go to law school, it really gave me a lot to think about. So my question is for both of you, actually. What do you both expect and hope from our laws and legislations about abortion and defining personhood for the future? Basically, where do you see there are gaps in our definitions, and how can our legislations, our legislators, courts, how can they improve? Thank you.
Do you want to go first? I've been talking a lot. It's up to you.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. To be candid, and it probably won't surprise you based on what I've said here, I'm very alarmed about where we are right now. I'm very alarmed about the decision, of course, that was made in Dobbs, because what I do really think the Supreme Court has announced is that they don't think that women and girls are human beings. And this is at the same time that you are seeing from the same ideological end of the spectrum that there's constant attempts to dehumanize and to degrade other human beings, people who are actually here, including the undocumented, including those who are sexual minorities. So you have this terrible, I think, worst of both worlds, where we are dehumanizing people who do exist, and that everyone does agree exists, and we're doing this at the same time that we are elevating whatever philosophical, spiritual, religious beliefs we might have about the unborn. We're elevating that above all, and I think that that's a very scary time because, of course, those two things go in tandem, at least for the actual fate of women and girls. So I'm very alarmed about that. I think it's going to get worse. I think it has been the admission of this administration that they want to make it worse, and so I am very fearful for all of those women and girls who have already suffered because of the fallout of Dobbs, all the women who are bleeding out in emergency rooms and in parking lots. I think it's only going to get worse.
I would say that, first of all, these are not religious arguments whatsoever. This is a question of rights and children's rights, and our legal system is not just designed to protect children, or not just designed to protect adults, it should also protect children. In fact, I would argue, as I stated earlier, that children have special rights that adults don't have, like the right to be fed and sheltered by their parents or by their adoptive parents. And so I believe that, in particular, we were talking about girls and women's rights, as Dr. Franks was speaking to, and girls in the womb have a right to their bodily autonomy and a right to not be killed by abortion, just as much as boys do. And so I think the legal framework we should have, as I've been stating, is that our legal system should recognize what our Constitution already does under the 14th Amendment, that all persons have the right to equal protection under the law. And we can't make the birth canal this magical moment when all of a sudden you have rights conferred to you as a person. There's nothing magical about that moment. You merely transition from being dependent on your mother inside of her body to being dependent on your mother outside of her body. But your mother still has a responsibility to care for this new body. And so our legal system should protect the rights of children both inside and outside of the womb, and that first right is life, and they should ensure that that right is protected.
Hi, thank you so much. This was a super interesting debate. I wanted to ask, as Miss Lila Rose commented, caring for a newborn is incredible work. And by the way, this question is for both of you guys. If a woman, a girl, is able to carry full term with no medical issues, yet is an unwilling pregnancy, what is your opinion on the fact, this is an age-old question, that the woman must put aside her life goals in order to take responsibility and care for this newborn for the entire 18 years?
Well, I would say that she has the responsibility to extend care to that newborn until she might be able to safely transfer care to another adult that can then provide that care. But she does still have the responsibility to care for that child for as long as that child is under her direct supervision, dependent on her body, whether that's in or outside of the womb. So that's why I think adoption can be, though it can be very difficult, it can be a very beautiful solution to a mother who feels that she cannot invest that 18 years, or parents who feels they cannot invest those 18 years into that child. And in that case, I would recommend that we remember that there's probably 1 million, some estimate 2 million couples who are longing to adopt newborns that have been vetted and are part of adoption agencies. So I would recommend that if she feels that she can't raise that child for 18 years, that she consider adoption.
I guess I'm wondering where all the men are. I'm not
there's
sure
child
that
support
when we're
that's
talking
required.
when we're talking about actually having to provide for a child, there's no gender predisposition for caring for a child. Once the child is born, equally, one would hope that the two people who were involved in creating that child should have equal responsibilities for taking care of that child. So that would be my first question about your question. And the second would be, I hope that it would not be the case that we would expect or think that it's an obligation for a mother to give up all of her dreams to take care of a child. I think if we were really trying to fulfill the promise of a pro-life position, we would, as a society, say every time a child is born, basically they get all the support financially from the government, right? Because we shouldn't have it be contingent on whether or not someone is in poverty or whether or not they're going to get child support from an absentee father. If we really wanted those children to be taken care of, we should be trying to take care of those children regardless of the individual capacities or abilities of any individual. I don't think we should leave it to those kinds of contingencies if we actually cared about children.
Thank you so much. Also, I love your pants, Dr. Franks.
Thank you.
Do government workers have to use their bodies to care for children that are given up for adoption? Are given up to the government?
sorry, what?
Oh, you just said the government should have to care for these children.
I'm saying
Do-
financially.
Do government
Financially.
workers have to provide that?
Financially.
Okay, so taxpayers have to give their money to the government that then provides for the child.
Yes.
My question is for Dr. Franks. You compared abortion to self-defense, even from a child who is innocent. You compared it to a child holding a gun at their parent, whether or not they knew that that could potentially be lethal force, and that it would be justifiable to use self-defense in order to preserve your life in that scenario, which would include lethal violence against a child in order to stop them from shooting you. I am a bit confused about this just because the US maternal mortality rate is 0.0003%, and I don't see how that's comparable to self-defense because it would seem that pregnancy has a far smaller chance of killing you than even something like driving a car. So in your view, how is that comparable to self-defense? Or how would self-defense apply to that when the maternal mortality rate is less than 0.00%?
Well, first, I want to point out the maternal mortality rate in the United States is abysmal. Women are dying from childbirth. This is a thing that happens in the United States. It is mostly preventable. We are doing much worse than most other countries, and I think that that is something that we should note with sadness, and particularly note that when the rates are, 3 to 4 times higher for Black women, we should really feel ashamed about that. So I think that that is one part that we should make clear. The analogy to self-defense, yes, in the actual self-defense scenario, there has to be some kind of imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death. Now, at any given moment, though, a person who is waving a gun at you may or may not do anything with that gun. They may not. We don't wait for the moment, right? It is a question about whether or not, from that perspective, objectively speaking, there is a credible threat. So that is the reason why I was using it as an analogy. Is that going to be the situation for every pregnancy? No. But other situations, and this is the reason why I mentioned others, is, for instance, if someone has been invited into your home, and for whatever reason, you no longer want them in your home. And it doesn't have to be because they're threatening you. It can just be that they've done something you don't like, and you said, you have to go home now, and they say, I'm not going to do it. They are not presenting you with a dire threat to your bodily safety necessarily. They might, but they're just being someplace where you said they could not be. You are entitled, in most places, to remove them with force if necessary. So if you have that much right over your property, the idea that a woman or a girl would have less rights than that over her own body seems unintelligible to me.
Okay. I'm afraid after this, we've only got time for 2 more questions, and then we will conclude.
Okay, Dr. France, my daughter has a question for you. So she still relies on me, my skin for warmth, and my breast for nutrition. Would you consider her legally my property, according to your legal argument?
No, I'm not suggesting that children are property. What I'm suggesting is that people have more rights over their property than we consider women to have over their bodies.
Okay, well, I'm just saying she has a right to my skin and my
I don't believe she's
body
actually
for
saying
nutrition. Well, her needs say things, but anyway, well, thank you.
Hi, this is a question for Dr. Franks. You've affirmed in this debate that you believe in the dignity of human life, and you've defined that as including all born people. And I'm curious because Ms. Rose brought this up in her opening statement, that societies at large throughout history have defined personhood in a certain way, and it's excluded people, included people. They've considered people not to be, or they've considered beings not to be people. And I'm curious, what makes your basis, what makes your view on who deserves the dignity of human life, and who is encompassed in that? What makes that right for you?
Thank you. The question for me is, the alternative is to say that if we're going to say that the unborn, at whatever stage, have rights over and against the consent of the mother, the woman who is pregnant, the girl who is pregnant, because we do need to keep in mind we're not just talking about adults. I'm saying that any position that would say that that being has rights over that woman or that girl's is to say that that woman or that girl does not have full human rights. That is what I know. That is the thing that makes sense, right? Because that is an exceptional way of treating a human being. And that has always led us to a very dark path. And not for nothing, right? And I know that many of you may know this because you have the privilege at Georgetown Law School, at least, of having a professor named Michelle Goodwin who's written about this, about the close ties between slavery and forced birth, right? That those things go hand in hand. The idea that you can enslave someone, you can force them to labor for you against their will, these things are completely in keeping with each other. The idea that you can take someone's body and their labor without consent, and that I think history has shown us is a very bad path to go down.
Hello. My question relates to the idea of objective versus subjective reality, especially with regard to making laws. So especially for Dr. Franks, since you brought up how our morals are relatively, for a lot of different claims, subjective, why should the government presume an atheistic, secularist idea, especially with regard to making legislation? Is it not an absolutist moral claim to begin with, to say that morals are subjective, and therefore you're devaluing any other side to this with regard to making objective claims about human life starting at conception? Like what leads you to be able to make that determination that as an objective statement, morals are subjective?
I think it's just a descriptive statement. I think there's no way to point to any basis for a moral code that is anything other than subjective, which doesn't make it bad, to be clear. Everybody starts from some place of moral intuition, right? We have feelings about how we think the world should work, about how people should be treated. The question for law is, when are you allowed to use those beliefs and impose them on those who don't believe the same way you do? Now, for someone who thinks that abortion is murder, it is an obvious answer to say, well, then you should not participate in that activity. But if other people say it is not murder, it is in fact the way that a person can protect themselves and protect their own bodily integrity, what right would that person have to say, no, you can't believe that, and I'm going to force you to give birth anyway? That, I think, the burden of proof always has to be on the state or the force that is trying to say, I'm going to make you do something that you do not want to do. And the concept of having religious freedom in this country, we sometimes forget, is to say that you are allowed to practice your religion, but the anti-establishment clause, which is what it really should be called in the First Amendment, says we're not establishing religions here. You don't get to make religious choices for someone else. You have to leave the social space. The space of the law has to be up for people to make their own decisions, unless you can find an independent reason that people broadly agree on about harms to other people. You can't just use your own subjective morals. It's a place to start, it's not a place to end.
I don't know if it makes sense. I think just a quick answer in that, I think there are absolutely moral absolutes, including do not kill an innocent person. And I think that, this idea that you should not have to do something that you don't want to do. You have this radical right to do what you want to do. And if someone makes you do something you don't want to do, that's violating your rights. Every single day, many laws in our legal code govern your actions, what you guys do with your bodies, whether you're driving, you're walking down the street, you're interacting with other people. Laws do govern our bodies and affect our bodily autonomy every day. And that should extend to protecting preborn children.
But if we did have that viewpoint, we could also say there shouldn't be any laws against rape either, because it's a thing you don't want to do and somebody else wants to, therefore. And as you yourself said, the law should be drawn, we should draw the line at least at forced organ donation. So you think that there is a line, it's just that we seem to disagree about where the line is.
Well, I think we agree that rape is wrong because a man doesn't have the right to have sex with a woman who's not consenting to have sex with him, but a child has a right to nourishment and to not be killed. So I think there's a difference between a man wanting to rape and a child wanting to eat or to live.
Thank you again, Lila Rose and Dr. Franks, for this incredible event. It was such an honor to host you both. Never before has Georgetown Right to Life been able to hold a debate such as this one. To quote one of my dear theology professors, this moment, what we have observed here tonight, is what I think academia and the university should be, an honest debate between adamantly opposed scholars about questions central to the meaning of life. And I am just immensely grateful that we were able to pull it off. Before I say one final thank you, I wanted to make a few short announcements. As was mentioned at the beginning of tonight's debate, this Saturday is the Cardinal O'Connor Conference on Life, where Lila Rose will be giving the keynote address. If this discussion here tonight interested you, I highly recommend that you register for this amazing opportunity. Please see the flyers in the back after the event. Additionally, tomorrow is the March for Life. If you are a Georgetown student and would like to join us on our buses provided by the university, please see any of tonight's volunteers to help you sign up. Thank you again for your attendance here tonight. And now let's give one final round of applause to our speakers.